Hi, I am Arti Ramsaroop, a member of the AFBC team. The Association of Former British Colonies, or AFBC, was established in May 2020. Currently, the AFBC is a project which examines the legacies of British colonization through educational content and social dialogue and seeks to inform global policy change around decolonization and reparations. The AFBC promotes this project through social media and connects with a global audience by addressing key topics such as racial inequality, British colonial rule, and decolonization. Today, I am joined by Dr. Robert Williams. Dr. Williams is a political and urban ethnographer with British training in history and sociology. He conducts fieldwork in the United States, the United Kingdom, and the United Arab Emirates. His latest publication is entitled Garrison State Hegemony in US Politics, a critical ethnohistory of corruption and power in the world's oldest democracy. Our topic today is focused on the history and legacies of British colonization in present-day United States of America, and we intend to explore how British colonial rule has and continues to influence US law and politics. The case of African Americans and African descended populations in this context will also be addressed. Dr. Williams, I would like to welcome you to the AFBC platform and extend my thanks for agreeing to be part of this interview. Before we get into the questions, can you tell our audience a bit more about yourself and your background?
I'd be happy to, Arti. And I want to thank James and AFBC for my invitation. A little bit more. So before I began my undergraduate education, even, I was a former U.S. Air Force Assistant Squadron Historian for the 964th Airborne Warning Control Squadron, or AWACS. And that opened my eyes at a young age to the maintenance of global neo-colonial empire. Currently, I teach technology and human values at the University of Akron. So that pretty much sums up what I'm doing right now and where I came from.
Excellent. So let us go into the first leg of our interview, where we will talk about British colonization in America in a general context. So can we start with some dates and why the British decided to colonize America, or what became the 13 American colonies?
So the dates is the easy part. And then the second part can be a lengthy answer, but I'll try to shorten it as best I can. British colonization in America began when the London Company eyed Algonquian American land in what they now call Virginia and claimed dominion over it. There's a university in Virginia today called Old Dominion University in reference to this act, where the British just look around at other people's land and say, oh, I like that. That's mine. And that's what happened. It became the colony of Virginia. Why did that happen? Well, we have to back up a little bit into history. Before I read John Locke, I want to talk about the Spanish Armada in 1588. Over 100 ships were sent by that Catholic king to put an end to what they termed pirating of their ships. They were robbing the Aztecs and the Inca, right? Well, mostly the Aztecs. They were robbing the Aztecs of their gold, and the English ships were picking them off. And they loved to fly the Dutch flag when they did that. The English are like that. They never want to take the blame for what they're doing. That wasn't me. That was the Dutch flag. That wasn't the British flag. They're very good at pretending they don't do anything in the world, and they do a lot, which I'll get to later, I hope, in this interview. So the English don't want to fall under the thumb of the Spanish, the way it looks like all of South America has, and a good part of the southern North America, all the way, to California. California was a state under the thumb of the Spanish. And so they're trying to get a piece of this. And they also need to fund their army and their navy. And how do they do that? And they're looking at the Dutch. The Dutch are doing they're doing corporation and colonies. And so the English are going to copy them too. Why are they going to copy them? Because they're Protestants who don't want to be under the thumb of the Catholic. And since King Henry VIII, the British, they don't want to do that either. Now this comes to, it gathers a lot of steam during the English Civil War in the 1640s, when Oliver Cromwell deposes the king then and beats up his 12,000 Scottish troops in the town of Worcester and kills 3,000 of them. And the other 9,000 he sent to his Lord's Protectorate's prison, America. They got shipped off. America was a great place to get rid of anybody who didn't cooperate. You just sent them there. But also it was a great place to send indentured servants to labor in plantations. And why? So we go to my book, page 123, and we quote John Locke. John Locke, who was the son of a Cromwellian Puritan militant. So Cromwell led the Puritan militants to depose the king. And he wrote in his 1689 two treatises on civil government, trade, necessary to the produce of riches, and money, necessary to the carrying on of trade. Ultimately, the British Army and Navy required a monetary system that could be taxed to provide revenue to pay their arms manufacturers, shipbuilders, and military men. So I think I'm ready for the next question.
Okay. So what would you say from your research and your background was the perception of America or the 13 American colonies in Europe or London at the time of colonization or throughout in the early years of British colonization in America?
So you don't have the perception of America in Europe. You have perceptions.
Okay.
Depending on your social standing in their class system. Europe has a class system. They're ruled by kings and queens and aristocrats. So they have a class system. Where you are in that class system determines how you view what's happening in the Americas. The elites who are profiting from this, that's how they look at it, the way John Locke looked at it. If you're one of the victims, the lower classes who have no right to vote, not even in England did the working classes get the right to vote until 1867. Until then, just aristocratic 3% voted for members of parliament. So, most people in the United Kingdom, they suffered those laws. So how would they look at America? Well, that's a place to go to. That's a place to get out of here. I don't speak Turkish or Arabic, so I don't really want to go to the Ottoman Empire to improve my station in life. A lot of British people did. That's how later trade, illicit trade between the American colonies and the North African city-states in tea took place. There's a lot of British who had gone there to get away from these laws that they couldn't make, that they couldn't change because they didn't have the right to vote. So you had all these different views. We tend to think there is, the view or a view because the victims didn't get the right to histories. And so we only read his story, the man with the money, the golden rule. Remember the golden rule? He who has the gold makes the rules. Thank you.
Okay, and Speaking about making rules, what were some of the laws or policies that were put in place to govern the 13 American colonies or America?
So originally, everything was corporatized. So crown charters were given to different companies, and then they would establish, for example, the London Company I mentioned, they were given a charter to have and it would be an extension of the English common law, because this is a business venture. And so you have to have a uniform code of law that understands contracts and can support breaches of contract and remedy those breaches. So it's English civil law all the way. Now, eventually, in the North American seaboard colonies, some of the people, like the Puritans, for example, Massachusetts, were able to get those charters out of England and into North America. So they actually held the charters themselves. And then they began to make innovations like legislative assemblies for self-rule and self-lawmaking. These were all innovations. You didn't see that happening in England. Only the 3% did that.
Oh, right. And when we look at British colonization in America and British colonization in other territories, for example, the Caribbean, can you pinpoint similarities in the systems or differences? Would you say that it was one model that the British were using throughout, or did they tailor it to the different areas?
So when I compared my historical evidence with North American colonies, seaboard colonies, with the histories by Professor Hilary Beckles of the University of the West Indies, I did note similarities in a colonial policy of the corporatization of Caribbean plantations with the corporatization of North American mainland plantations. Also similarities with the indentured servitude, and then the slave labor, the administrative systems, and the record keeping. That's really phenomenal. Like there's nothing that exists in world history until this time period. And also the extreme violence to support these.
Okay. And if we were to move the conversation to the indigenous populations in America, um, when we look at the British rule and the British sort of invasion into America, there were people there already, these indigenous populations. How did the British coming in impact the indigenous people that were there already?
Again, I want to quote this African American lawyer. Her last name was Crenshaw, and she's in my book on page 124. Speaking from the perspective of a contemporary African American, Crenshaw explained these attitudes. Okay, I have to catch myself sometimes because some of this stuff is very heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is what she says. We are a society that has been structured from top to bottom by race. Let's circumvent, let's punish them. Let's ostracize them. It's a long-standing habit. Racism and wars in support of property acquisition and the Garrison State are key cultural legacies of institutional change and continuity. Next question.
Yeah. No, I know it's
I can cry real easy at some of this stuff.
yeah.
It was horrible. Like I had to review some material for this interview. It was just horrible. It's PTSD triggering.
Yes, definitely.
to have to read these things and think about them.
Okay, so moving on to or continuing with the legacies of British colonization. If we were to look at present day United States of America, and I'm sure there are many legacies. Can you speak a little bit on that? Legacies of British colonization in present day USA.
Yeah. Indigenous people
Mhm.
continue to lament and suffer from England's colonization of North America. And African Americans continue to also suffer from England's introduction of slavery to her North American colonies.
And what would you say? And I'm sure there isn't one attitude, but there would be multiple attitudes or perspectives when we look at the US or the current people in America. What would you say is the current attitude towards British colonization? How do people perceive that part of history?
Well, it depends who you are.
Exactly.
If you're a descendant of the settlers, you're taught a myth
Mm-hmm.
that the colonizers came in here and instead of burning down all the Walmarts or Tesco's, whatever the big boxes are called there in the Caribbean, where people get their food. Imagine if somebody just came into your country today and started bulldozing all your big box food stores. Where are you going to get your food? Why are they doing that? This is what the English did. They came in here and started first how they could destroy a whole forest in one season. How they would girdle it. They would take the bark off all the way around. When you do that, now the bark cannot bring the nourishment to the rest of the tree and it dies. Then the next year they come in there and they light a match and it all burns down. Firelands. They're called firelands. They were burning down. The Native Americans are like, what are they doing? This is where we get our food. They're burning down our food stores. The wilderness is where we get our food. They didn't farm. They didn't even like the English's farmed domesticated animals. They were blubbery and they said this is not good nourishment. You have to take the animal from the wild. This is good meat. This meat from the farm is not good meat. And they were just doing this. They didn't even ask. They just came in and started. It was crazy. From the point of view of Indigenous Americans, they just could not understand these people, what they were doing. And that's because Indigenous Americans didn't commoditize nature the way the English did. The English are looking for how can I get every little bit of money because I need money to fund my military. I need money to pay the coal miners to dig the ore. I need money to pay the blacksmith to melt that down into bullets and cannonballs and make cannons themselves even. I need to pay people. The day of the medieval serf where he just gave one tenth of his harvest to the knight, that didn't work anymore. The knights couldn't protect the farmers anymore. They could get shot and killed, go right through their armor. Even before that, the Mongol invasion. You know why that was so famous? I mean, not so famous, but so effective everywhere, except Northern Europe. It didn't work because they had a compound bow made out of glues, and that compound bow could pierce any armor. But when they got to Germany, the weather was always wet and damp, and their bows began to fall apart. That's the only reason why the Germans weren't conquered.
Very interesting. So, moving our conversation to the American War of Independence, let us speak a little bit about the American War of Independence and what exactly um, that entailed and how, what caused this, what were the immediate causal factors, and speak a little bit about the immediate effects of the American War of Independence.
This is not going to be a short story, unfortunately, because most people in America are taught a mythology, which I think Patrick Henry spoke to when he wrote back in the 1700s at the time of the Revolution. War is the gambling table of governments, and citizens the dupes of the game. So how were the citizens who fought the American Revolutionary War dupes? Because they actually were given reasons to fight, like, no taxation without representation, liberty, freedom of speech, all these, freedom of religion, all these kind of, you should fight for these reasons. But the real spark to that revolution was the second wealthiest man in the colonies, John Hancock, who has the largest signature on the Declaration of Independence. He's his one of his buddies comes up to his office to visit him, and he's got his head in his hands, and he's, John, what's wrong? And he says, I'm ruined. What do you mean you're ruined? He says, there's tea in the harbor, in Boston Harbor, from the East India Tea Company. It went bankrupt and the government took it over, and they're selling it like 1/10 the price. I can't smuggle tea and sell it that cheap. I'm out of business. Wow. Hey, John, there's this guy named Samuel Adams. He's real upset about that tea in the harbor. Why would anybody be upset with cheap tea? He says there's a 2 pence stamp tax on there, and that's the start of things, and blah blah blah. And John's like, so what? It's still way cheaper than tea I can sell, even with the 2 pence stamp tax on it. And he goes, yeah, but John, he's an excellent speaker. He's a lawyer, and when he talks, people listen. Really? I want to see this guy. So he invites the Samuel Adams up to see him. Sam, I hear you're real upset about that tea in the harbor. And Samuel Adams launches into his spiel about no taxation without representation, blah, blah, blah. And when he's finished, John Hancock says, John, I think that's a, no, Samuel, I think that's a very good message. I'd like to help you get that out. So he funds him. And these Sons of Liberty pop up all up and down the East Coast, and committees of correspondence, they're all writing, trying to flare. Now there's a snowball. So the immediate effect was Samuel Adams and his friends, dressed up as Mohican Americans, went out there and threw the tea into the harbor. And John Hancock's like, I'm saved. I'm not out of business. But now he's got this snowball rolling downhill, collecting more and more snow. It leads to a revolution. That's why he put his name the biggest. But they don't, these elites, they're not really upset with the Lockean neoliberal system of enterprise that has been established in those colonies. They're not really upset with that. But they have to have a revolution. They have to start a new country. Should I stop there?
Now you can continue if you wish.
I might be answering some of your future questions if I don't stop.
Okay. Well, let us talk a bit about the African population, the African descended population in America at that time. How did they fit into the struggle for independence, or this?
So the first, I think, Africans were brought kind of by accident. The English were pretending to be Dutch again, flying Dutch flags and raiding Spanish galleons and Portuguese galleons. And they showed up in Virginia, I think it was 1620, with like 20 Africans. These had been Portuguese slaves destined for sale in, I think, probably Brazil or one of the other Portuguese colonies. And they had them in Virginia, and they didn't know what to do with them. There was no slavery in England or their colonies yet. And so the only thing in the law was indentured servitude. So they worked them for 5 years as indentured servants, and then they had their freedom. Interesting thing is when you study these 20 people and you study their cultural, their progeny and their reproduction, like they had suffered such a trauma that like not even a handful of them ever got married out of those 20. They were so damaged emotionally that they just pretty much lived the rest of their lives as hermits in those colonies. Which I mean makes sense. Think about this. You know, like Africa is the largest continent on the earth, isn't it? I think it's bigger than Asia. And all these different languages. So how do you even communicate? Probably those 20 people didn't even speak the same language. They probably spoke 20 different languages. So, or maybe the handful that did get married could find someone that from their language even and their culture. But you couldn't even share your thoughts with anybody because there was no language to communicate with. It's just terrible. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's what happened. Then they began to copy the slavery, and that's so horrible. I don't even want to talk about it, but I will, because they were not considered people. They had no rights whatsoever, none. When that Constitution, not the first one, the Articles of Confederation, the second one, which I'm jumping ahead of myself, but they were not recognized in there as people. And for census purposes, they were counted as 3/5 of a person. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Yeah. Okay, so this newly independent United States of America, what did this independent nation look like? How was it structured socially, politically, economically? Would you say it was still British, or did it still carry the British model exactly as it was before? How did it change?
Wow, there's a lot of questions in there. 3 of them actually. Okay, so the early USA looked a lot like the EU looks today, the European Union. Okay, the states that constitute the European Union are independent states, and that's how the early USA was. People before the Civil War, people used to say the United States of America are a great place to visit. Not is. But after the Civil War, then they would say it became one nation. Then he would say the United States of America is. But before that, they were all looked at as independent states with different laws, a lot of different things. It wasn't a lot to hold them in common. Its social structure was English. So the northern states, they reflected the cultural dialects and mores of southern England, because that's where they came from. And then USA's southern states reflected England's north, because that's where they came from. So their dialects are actually Yorkshire dialects down south. The political and economic system fashion, the early founders, they borrowed from indigenous examples of federation to write the USA's first constitution, the Articles of Confederation. That constitution suffered a coup d'etat just 11 years later. That's in my book as well in part 3. And it was replaced with a Romanist one. So since 1787, USA has been a Roman-style republic, eventually erupting into global empire hand in hand with the mother country. How British exactly was and is USA? USA's legal system is very English. I would say our English, our legal system is more English than the British system is today. They've kind of moved on and maybe borrowed some things from continental Europe, and we're still stuck in time. We very much cling to that English common law, that all of our contracts, all our contract law, and even marriage, even when you become a student at school, you're signing a contract with the university. It's a contracts and social order. It's all very English here.
Okay, so continuing on with that point of how British is the USA, would you agree then that independence sort of changed the face of America in that there was a new flag, different things like that, common things that come with independence, but the systems and institutions in the United States remained intact? And can you give some examples?
So that the answer to that question is yes and no.
Okay.
So some things did change the face of America, and some things did remain intact. The flag is a perfect example. That changed the face of America. That yellow flag of liberty, 13 colonies joined together as a serpent. And if you step on any one of those 13 sections of the serpent, it strikes you, swings around, strikes you on the ankle, right? So that didn't last very long. That went out the window with the Articles of Confederation and was replaced with the red, white, and blue. Red, white, and blue, that's the Union Jack. Yeah. The British got us back. Very, very fast. And it's just amazing. Like in the news today, everybody can tell you about the Queen. They can know her name. Not the Queen of Norway, not the Queen of Luxembourg, but they're talking about the Queen of England. And they can tell you about her kids even. They probably know both her sons' names or grandsons' names, sorry. Talking about Prince Charles and his kids, yeah. So it's just crazy. Like, how is this country independent? You fought 2 wars against monarchy. You said it was an illegitimate form of government at the time, and yet you're just can't read the next thing in the media about the monarchy there.
Yes.
It's not by accident.
Okay, so bringing our conversation back to African Americans, let us speak a little bit about African Americans and British colonization. So I know you spoke about this a little bit before, but if you can go into a little bit more detail about how British colonization set the course for the experiences of African Americans and African descended populations in the USA today.
So English colonization of USA commoditized nature. I did say that. Maybe we had a difficulty and we had to restart this. So maybe I didn't say it this time. I think I said it the first time. Anyway, that commoditization of nature continues to affect, I mean, it included animals, and not just animals, but indigenous peoples. And that was extended then to Africans. They did enslave indigenous peoples, but smallpox would kill them very quickly. And so they needed people who they could work like animals, like mules and ox, that wouldn't die from disease the way the the smallpox was killing the indigenous people here in America. So they enslaved people from India. People from India were enslaved as well, not just Africa. But not too much here did they bring them to here, North America, but they did bring them to the North American islands where the English had sugar plantations.
And what are some legacies of British colonization that continue to affect African Americans to this day?
Oh, I remember that.
Mm.
Crenshaw. Yes. She said, we are a society that has been structured from top to bottom by race.
Mm.
Let's circumvent, let's not consult them. Let's change the rules so we don't need their agreement. Let's punish them, let's ostracize them. It's a long-standing habit.
Mm.
Yeah, that's your legacy.
Yeah.
You go to cities like, Cleveland, Detroit, cities around here, and you find what I would call a 21st century slave plantation.
Mm.
Okay, they're not laboring, but they're stuck there, living like Native Americans on their reservations in the what was once called the Great American Desert. They're just stuck in these cities. They can't get corporate jobs because they've gone to the worst schools that you ever saw in your life, and they don't even know how to interview for a good job in this neoliberal corporatist system. Okay, so if you want to get ahead, even in academia is a neoliberal enterprise. When we talk about decolonization, we have to talk about, do we want to perpetuate all these things that the colonizers have put in place? Do we really want to reproduce them? Anyway, those are some of the legacies.
Yeah. So when examining slavery and the aftermath of slavery in the US, from your research or your experience, would you say that African Americans they hold white Americans responsible, or present day Britain responsible for these legacies that continue to affect them?
Well, this is a hard question because you're homogenizing a lot of disparate groups, but I'll try to answer it. The vast majority of white colonial settlers to England's colonies in North America came from Britain,
Mm-hmm.
and uh, these white so-called Americans or Yanks considered themselves to be British, entitled to representation in Parliament. So when that failed to come to fruition, a minority of them rebelled and successfully cut ties with the mother country to become an independent federation of states.
Mm-hmm.
Those whites in the northern states banned slavery, whilst those in the southern states did not. Hence, a civil war erupted from 1860 to 1865 between these states until the northern states were successful and Congress subsequently banned slavery throughout the USA. These historical dynamics lead most to a view that white Northerners opposed slavery, while too many white Southerners continue to mourn its demise. That said, such views on slavery overlook widespread continued racism amongst white populations everywhere in this country. That's the best I can speak on that. I mean, the Irish, they weren't even considered people. They were considered white apes.
Mm.
by the British, by the English. I don't know about the Scottish and the Welsh and the Cornish, if they looked at them, the original Britons, if they looked at them in that way, but the English certainly did. And when they came over here and finally achieved parity with other white people after a lot of suffering and discrimination, then they forgot their roots. So, and there are too many. I mean, it's very hard to find an African American that's not part Irish. That's how much mixing there was between them for years, for centuries, for decades. And but the Irish, you know, generally, they've seemed to have forgotten their history, their roots. It's just sad to see so many of them you know, reproducing racism.
Yes. So if we were to talk a bit about just continuing from what you said there about identity and how uh, white Americans uh, identify presently in the US. Would you say they identify as European? And I'm trying to figure out if we can how we can differentiate between these two groups of people of with European descent in America presently and Europeans then in Britain itself, or not European, sorry, but British people. I'm trying to get to if we were to look at a group that we can say is responsible or attach some sort of responsibility, and this is from an let's say from an African American perspective. Um, can you is the general consensus then amongst people of African descent that they that these experiences came from white Americans or uh, present day Britain?
The Britain has been so many centuries removed since the War of Independence that nobody's going to be pointing fingers at them.
Okay.
That the fingers are going to be pointed at the white people, the white establishment, the people who the elites and those who helped them in this country. I mean, World War II, the United States was dragging its feet to go into World War II. And why? Because of racism. You know, the first fight that Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, the US boxing champion, had against Max Schmeling, Hitler's fighter, the first fight, who do you think most white Americans were rooting for?
Not sure.
Hitler's fighter.
Right.
Because he was white. And it wasn't until, you know, all this stuff came to light later, you know, in the rematch when Joe Louis stopped Schmeling in the first round. That was the first time ever that white Americans ever rooted for a non-white athlete. And he was part white. He was mixed. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, he was mixed. But this so disturbed President Eisenhower. He was General Eisenhower, because when he got to Germany and they realized they were just months away from inventing the nuclear bomb. And then he took all those scientists to America and they invented a nuclear bomb and they nuked 2 cities of civilians in Japan. But it's a terrible what they did. It's a sad thing that I have to tell you I'm an American and I have these crimes on my head. I tried so hard to immigrate to a different country. But I don't know where you could go. Maybe that doesn't do this. I think there's an island in the Indian Ocean Can't remember the name of it. They don't have an army. That's about the only place you could go, I guess. But Eisenhower was so disturbed by the racism of the Americans and how they were so divided between themselves and how that slowed the U.S. response to Germany, and how if we were just months later, we would have lost, because we wouldn't even be having this conversation today. We'd be speaking in German probably. Sprechen the Deutsch? Anyway, so when he became president, he made the federal government take the lead. He broke up the Jim Crow laws in the South. He integrated Arkansas. He sent the National Guard down there to make sure they were integrated. He made sure that they got the GI Bill, African Americans, so they could go to school and get educated and buy houses through the FHA loans, Federal Housing Administration. He did all of this because he wanted to stop this divisiveness between Americans. And it still lingers. We're still being divided here. I don't like it. It's just horrible. Yeah, and we'll talk about what should be done when you ask me about reparations. You're going to ask me about them? Yeah. Great.
That is where we are going now. So that was my reason for trying to to ask about where fingers are being pointed, because moving on now, I'm gonna ask you to speak a little bit about reparations and African Americans in the United States. So what is the reparations argument like in the United States presently?
So it's a discussion that is still forming. And I like what California has been doing in this regard, but it is really hard to listen, but they're trying to talk about it. And to me, the term reparations, it springs from the word repair. So that reparations are any action or actions taken to repair the damage that victims of slavery and colonization continue to suffer. It constitutes actions to restore extinct cultural logics, extinct languages, property restitutions, and safety nets to ensure victims are no longer the first to suffer from disasters, whether they're economic or environmental.
Okay, so within this discussion about reparations in the United States, which group or groups are being held responsible, or who are the who is being looked at then to sort of repair and provide some sort of compensation, not just monetary compensation, but compensation in general to African descended populations in the United States?
Well, so again, even though the Pentagon provides the brawn today to British Empire, which I don't see has gone away. They want you to believe that, but I was in the military side by side with the Brits everywhere around the world. They did not go away. It's just US powered British Empire. But most Americans today do not see the USA as a neo-colony of Britain or suffering from neo-colonialism, as all of England's other colonies suffer, or so-called former colonies. So therefore, these fingers are pointed in the USA at their own power structure, which is overwhelmingly white. But this power structure in this country has to do the reparations. They have to take the actions to restore the damage that was done and stop the cultural reproduction of this damage.
Okay. And in your opinion, what would reparations look like within the United States? Like if you can give some examples of ways in which reparations can be ways in which that the entire African American situation, how can these people be given some sort of justice?
God. I would begin first with the safety nets because that's the easiest to do. Those are you fund them. Safety nets so that they are not the first to suffer any disaster, whether it's economic or even environmental. I don't know how it is in Trinidad, but even here in my county, okay, where is the county landfill? The biggest landfill in the county is right here in Oberlin. And then there used to be a landfill in South Illyria. What does Oberlin and South Illyria have in common? They have the largest percentage per capita of African Americans living in those cities. So you don't see the landfill in the white communities. You don't see them in Avon Lake or Avon or North Ridgeville. You see them, and if you do see them in a town like Elyria, which is the county seat, well, it doesn't have it anymore. It was on the south side where the African Americans live. So they're always the first to suffer. They have to have the landfills. They have to breathe the toxic air. They have to drink the water from the landfill leaching into the water that they drink. If you go fishing in any of the rivers, they're polluted with PFAs so many hundreds above allowed limits. And this is everywhere in the country. And you got to have a safety net. You have to make sure that these people are not the first to suffer. When their ancestors came and they could write, you took their fingers off one by one until they stopped writing. If they could, if they were Muslim people who came from like they were Nigeria had Muslim people, Mali had Muslim people. They would, if you recited the Quran in Arabic, they'd take your tongue out. So they deculturalized these people. And then they mixed them all up. So, this guy's speaking Yoruba, this guy's speaking Ghanaian, this guy's speaking from, maybe he's speaking Arabic from Mali, all different languages. They can't even communicate with each other. And then you take their moms and dads away from them. You take their grandparents away from them. So unlike any other ethnic group, every other ethnic group get to have their families with them, teach them things, help them with the kids. They didn't even get to have that. It's just horrible what happened. And nobody wants to do anything about it. Just, as long keep them out of my sight so I don't have to think about it. That's how the white people are. It's just terrible. So my next door neighbor is African American. He might be mixed, but I don't think his wife is. And I'm slightly mixed. My dad was African American, but he was mixed. He had more white than black. And then this neighbor over here, he was born in Halifax, England, but his parents are from the Ukraine, and being born in England does not give you British citizenship. So that's how he ended up here. Then there's a guy down here who's German. His mom and dad were killed in World War II by the Russians because they were German. But I mean, they didn't live in Germany. I think they lived in Hungary or some other country. But because they were German, his parents got killed. So there's a lot of trauma around me. But then we live with guns in this country. That's a whole different dynamic. Everybody here worships that gun because they say, well, we would still be British if we didn't have guns. That gun is what gave us our independence. They think they're independent. So they shoot each other 11,000 a year to have this right to keep and bear arms. It's just crazy. I lived in the UK in 2011. I counted, well, I didn't count them. The Times counted them for me. 39 gun homicides, they said. Now, America has 5 times the population. 39 times 5 is 195, not 11,000. These Yanks are crazy the way they shoot each other all the time. And then they just put it out of their mind. They act like, that doesn't happen. Yeah, it does. And when I was in 8th grade, John Mosney he was shot and killed by Dale Race, the dentist's son. Shot and killed him. You know, I've been all around the world teaching, and when I asked them, do you know somebody who was shot and killed? They can't raise their hand while they were in school. They just don't know. But it happens all around us, and we put it out of our minds. I got off topic. You want to talk about the reparations, and I'm telling you that with gun violence in America, it's real hard to repair anything.
But these things are, it's a bit difficult to speak about, but I think it's necessary that we talk about it. As we come to the end of our interview, though, I would like to ask you if there's anything else that you want to speak about on the topic, or any final comments before we close.
I don't know. I think it got, this topic, it's PTSD triggering. I think that's why I started talking about gun violence, because you cannot talk about what happened from slavery without visualizing the extreme violence that supported it. Mm-hmm. The violence that accompanied the maintenance of slavery in the United States was extreme. And if any individual experienced any kind of extreme violence in their life, just trying to think about this will be triggering. But I mean, that's a lot of people. And especially for African Americans, they don't have the safety nets. I've seen times when the police, during times of unrest, we're not going to go in there. We're just going to cordon the area and contain the violence. Well, who's living in there? These poor African American and other ethnic groups who don't have access to the establishment to get some reaction, to get help. And it's just, none of it's right. I like the way I've seen things done in England without the guns compared to the way things are done here.
Okay. Well, that brings us to the end of our interview. And I would just like to say thank you so much for agreeing to be part of this conversation today. Thank you for sharing your expertise and, talking about this topic. And I learned a lot. It's a lot of things are difficult to speak about, but I think having these conversations, getting the knowledge out there is important. And just thank you so much for being a part of the interview today. And I look forward to speaking with you in the future. Thank you.
You're welcome, Arti.